Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Hey everyone, Craig Baird here. Before I begin today's story, I want to take a moment to ask you to check me out on Patreon. There are several tiers with great benefits, including ad-free episodes delivered early to patrons. You can also donate directly to the show at www.canadaehx.com through Buy Me a Coffee or through e-transfer at crwbaird@gmail.com. Donations help keep the show going. I've also released my first history book, Canada's Main Street, the epic story of the Trans-Canada Highway. You can find it in most bookstores in Canada and through online retailers. You can find the links for Patreon, donating, and my book in my show notes. Okay, let's get to the show. The mountain was quiet that morning as the Rockies cast their long blue shadows. Lanterns flickered to life one by one in the darkness as men stepped into the cold. Just another day in a coal town. Boots scraped across as men moved down the street, their collars pulled high, lunch pails swinging at their sides. Some men walked with their brothers, some with their fathers, some with boys who had only started in the mine weeks earlier. No one said much. They never did. The mountain had a way of swallowing sound, and soon it would be taking much more. For hours the mountain held its breath. Then, without warning, the silence was broken as fire and pressure ripped through miles of tunnels in a violent chain reaction. Above ground, the town heard a sound no one would ever forget. A deep, violent thunder rising beneath their feet. Windows shaked, the ground buckled, and what happened next turned a quiet coal town into the site of a deadly mining disaster. I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X. Throughout this month, I'm looking at the history of my home province of Alberta, and today we continue our journey through Alberta's history by traveling deep into the wreckage of the mountain, far below the collapsed tunnels, to share an unlikely story of survival. This is the Hillcrest mine disaster. Charles Plummer Hill had always been on the search for coal. He was born in Delaware in 1862 and as a young man traveled west to find his fortune. He didn't find much in the way of riches, but he did find a love of the beauty of the Rocky Mountains. At 30, he became a U.S. Deputy Collector of Customs for a territory of 1,300 kilometers along the international border from British Columbia to Alberta. He was based in Creston, British Columbia, and often traveled by foot and horseback. He slept under the stars and became intimately familiar with the land. When he had time, he prospected for gold and coal, and by 1899 he had quit the U.S. Civil Service and turned to prospecting full-time. He was in present-day southern Alberta, near the Crow's Nest Pass, when he finally found what he was seeking, a large deposit of coal. He had finally struck it rich. Charles Hill bought land in July 1902 to build a mine in a town. He called it Hillcrest. 3 years later, he incorporated the Hillcrest Coal and Coke Company. He convinced the Canadian Pacific Railway to build a spur line to his new community, and with the prospect of steady work, miners from across North America and Europe arrived, and within a few years, Hillcrest was home to 1,000 people. Coal mining was big business. It paid well, but it came with a risk, and a big one at that. If you went into the belly of the mine, it wasn't guaranteed you would come back. Canada had already had a few disasters in 1887, 1891, and 1902, which killed 403 workers. And for those working the Hillcrest mine, the danger was ever present because of something that happened not too far away. Just 1 kilometer away from Hillcrest, the Bellevue mine was buzzing with activity. It was just across the river, and many of the miners at Hillcrest had worked at that mine before moving. The neighboring communities were close. There was the type of place where everyone knew everyone. And at 6:30 p.m. on December 10th, 1910, the ground shook in Hillcrest. Fearing the worst, everyone ran outside. An explosion of unknown origin had torn through the Bellevue mine, trapping miners underground. As was often the case in coal mines, the blast wasn't the only killer. What was left behind was afterdamp. An explosion forced the clean air out of the mine, leaving behind carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, a deadly cocktail able to kill in less than a minute. On that dark day, 42 men were in the mine, only 12 made it out alive. But somehow it actually could have been worse. If the explosion had happened during the day shift, over 200 miners would have been underground. In response to the disaster, the Alberta government created the province's first mine rescue car. It could carry 12 men, trained in mine rescue, from the larger community of Blairmore, 5 kilometers away, to a mine disaster site. The Bellevue disaster was terrible, but many miners in Hillcrest took solace in the fact that their mine was considered to be one of the safest in the Eastern Rockies. And soon life moved on, and over the next 4 years, the Bellevue disaster was a distant memory as babies were born and new families moved in, and by 1914, the Hillcrest mine was booming. But sadly, it wouldn't last. On January 31st, 1914, Andrew Scott, the district inspector, visited the mine. By then, over 300 men were extracting 1,400 tons of coal in 3 shifts. They'd come from all over the world, including Scotland and Austria, Ukraine, Italy, England, France, and the United States, all working together, side by side, in the hopes of a better life. Apart from some minor violations, everything seemed to be in order at the mine and in line with the provincial regulations. Now, these inspections were incredibly important. Mining companies, given the chance, often put profits ahead of worker safety. To prevent that, the province kept a close eye to determine if mines were unsafe, and if they were, they would be shut down, and that kept the mine owners in check. For the most part. Andrew Scott left the mine, and for the next 3 months, work ebbed and flowed. In the spring, production slowed down as demand for coal decreased to 1,000 tons per day on account of the warmer weather. And by then, it was just the beginning of April, and Andrew Scott was back to do another inspection. He found that in the number 2 mine, the ventilation and timber supports were up to par. And this might seem like an odd detail to bring up, but it will be important later in the story. Meanwhile, just because a mine passed an inspection didn't mean the work was any less dangerous. Every day, miners went deep into the mountain of the foothills of the Rockies and listened to every deafening creak and groan the earth made. Each day they dug deeper. It was difficult and back-breaking work done under the threat of cave-ins and explosions. And when the men left home in the morning, they didn't know if they would return. They were always painfully aware that the beginning of each shift could signal the last time they saw their loved ones. Miners, they have a keen ability to put danger out of their minds though, and at least work through it. And if something like what happened in Bellevue happened in Hillcrest, it would signal an accident or disaster had taken place. Their more assured and bigger threat came from a silent killer, the black lung that came from breathing in coal dust. It prevented many miners from reaching old age. However, as demand was low, the mine shut down and miners got a break from work for 2 days on June 17th and 18th. Then, as dawn broke on June 19th, the whistle from the engine house at Hillcrest blew, signaling the start of a new workday. At 7 a.m., the men kissed their wives goodbye and walked towards work as the sun rose over the mountains and the shuffling of boots was drowned out by the birds chirping. For the men, it would be the last bit of summer sun they would see, and as the men arrived at the mine, they crossed paths with fire boss William Adlam, who had just finished his daily inspection. The 2-hour walkthrough found 2 cave-ins and gas in 7 rooms. In 6 of those rooms, the gas was strong enough to put out a safety light, so he fenced them off. As he left, he put his report up where the workers gathered before their shifts and went home for breakfast. The miners knew to look for his very important report, so they knew the conditions they were facing in the mine and the long day ahead. But before their descent into the mine, each worker stopped by the timekeeper's office. His name was Robert Hood, and he would give each miner a square and a round tag. Then, fire bosses Sam Charleston and John Ironmonger inspected the miner's safety lamp and checked the tags that would be hooked where the miners were to work. The round tags were kept because they would be used to identify the men if disaster struck. By 7:30 a.m., 228 men went into the mine. Then, just a half hour later, Ironmonger fired the first of 5 shots to help loosen the coal. Soon, after 9 a.m., 7 more men went into the mine, to a total of 235 men. 3 men had missed their scheduled shift that day. Julien Lefort hadn't been feeling well, and he called in sick. Thomas Price had a brother from out of town visiting, so he switched shifts to be at the train station that morning. And the last man was Dan Kyle, and he was one lucky guy. He was born in England, where life was tough and work was limited, so Dan took a chance on moving across the ocean to Canada. In early 1912, he purchased a ticket on a new and luxurious passenger ship about to take its maiden voyage. But one of his friends wanted to come along, but he was unable to secure a ticket, so instead of traveling alone, Dan traded in his ticket in favor of passage on a smaller vessel with his friend. It turned out to be a very wise decision, because you may have heard of the ship he originally had a ticket for, the Titanic. So by trading in his ticket, Dan had avoided one of the worst maritime disasters in history, and instead made his way to Hillcrest, where he worked the morning shift at the mine. He wasn't at the mine that day because his boss had shifted him to the afternoon the day earlier, and so Dan was at home having a relaxing breakfast. 2 other men at the mine that day had also avoided disaster in the past. Charles Ehrlich and John Hood had been at the Turtle Mountain collapse that buried the town of Frank on April 29, 1903, and you might know it as the Frank Slide. I did an episode on that way back in 2023, so be sure to check it out. Their close call with death didn't deter him from mining again. For them and the other men of the Hillcrest mine, June 19th was just another day of back-breaking work. And for those above ground, life went on. Until the earth began to rumble beneath their feet, and their whole world would never be the same. At 9:30 a.m., Charles Ironmonger was working outside the mine when a sudden blast of air and pressure shot out of the entrance tunnel. The fire boss's 19-year-old brother was picked up and thrown across the yard and into the side of the hoist house. He died almost instantly because the hoist house 8-inch concrete wall had also been destroyed by the blast and its roof was blown off. Nearby, William Hutchinson and his brother David were at the number 3 mine entrance when they were knocked off their feet as smoke billowed around them and turned their world pitch black. David knew exactly what had happened. Somewhere in the deep, the mine had exploded. Once he got back on his feet, he ran out of the mine entrance and came across John Brown, the mine manager, who was nearby at the number 2 entrance. Brown was covered in black dust, but even in the chaos, he immediately realized something was very wrong. All day, every day, the mine's fan ran constantly to ventilate the mine. Now, it was silent. Alex May had been at the engine house when he heard a muffled noise and felt the ground shake. When he ran outside, he saw rocks shooting out of the fan at high speed. If he had been there minutes earlier, he would have been killed. But now he was joined by the mine manager, who was desperate to get the fan going because if there were any survivors underground, they wouldn't have much time if fresh air wasn't provided. Thankfully, they were able to get the fan going, but typically, the fan would draw air out of the mine, so they would be replaced by good air down into the mine from the entrances. But instead of that, they reversed the fan so they would just start pumping good air directly into the mine. But they had no idea if there would be any survivors down there. Meanwhile, across Hillcrest, the earth shook, dishes rattled, and people felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. Then came the sound everyone dreaded. 3 whistles from the powerhouse. The signal that an accident had happened was blown by Alex's father, Dan May. Now, if you're noticing a pattern in the names, you're not wrong. In mining towns like Hillcrest, brothers, fathers, and sons all worked side by side, which added to the horrors of those in the town when they walked out of their homes to see black smoke rising in the air. Hillcrest dropped what they were doing and immediately rushed towards the mine. None of them were sure what had happened to their loved ones, they just knew their worst nightmares had come true. Deep below the surface, miners had felt the blast tear through the mine. Some had died instantly, but others had survived. And aside from the ringing in their heads from the pressure wave, the mine around them was deathly quiet. It was also pitch black. Their safety lamps being off signaled growing levels of toxic gas. No sound. No light. So miners had to feel their way to safety, and they had very little time left. The lucky ones were near the entrances. Peter Dejay had been working 15 meters from the entrance when he felt the explosion. He was able to get to fresh air, but he had to do it by crawling over 2 dead horses and 3 dead men. Meanwhile, over in the slant of the number 2 mine, Joe Atchison had been working in a slant when he was suddenly deaf before a shockwave threw him to the ground. He managed to get back to his feet before a cloud of black smoke swarmed over him. He woke up 3 hours later under the warm summer sun, unaware he had been dragged out of the mine and towards safety. After the explosion, William Guthrow literally ran towards the light at the end of the tunnel, and as he did, he felt something grab his foot. He was suddenly trapped, so he looked down expecting to see a hand. Instead, he saw his boot was caught in the fork in the mining rail track, and as the air thickened with toxic gas around him, he cut his boot off with a pocket knife and ran for his life. And there would be other early survivors, including a man by the name of Yeadon, who was in the mine when the explosion happened and was immediately knocked unconscious. He came to thanks to the use of an early portable resuscitator used by physicians who had spent 45 minutes keeping him alive. He said, "They said they feared I would never come to, but I am here to tell the tale." Yeadon was nearly taken by the Grim Reaper, but he was desperate to join the rescue mission, and as soon as he was able to, he was on his way back into the mine. Malcolm Link and Charles Jones had been in the number 15 mine chute when they heard what they thought was a cannon. They dropped to their hands and feet and crawled to safety. Now, all of these men were able to get out fairly quickly because they were close to the surface, but those that were further into the mine could only pray to be found before it was too late. As I mentioned earlier in this episode, after the Bellevue mine disaster, the provincial government created the Alberta Mine Rescue Car No. 1. It was stationed nearby in Blairmore, and 30 minutes after the disaster at Hillcrest happened, Superintendent Henry James received notice and immediately called the Canadian Pacific Railway to get a locomotive to pull the rescue car. But once it arrived at the Hillcrest station, there was a problem. The car either had to be switched over to the Hillcrest Railway tracks to travel to the mine, or it had to be disconnected from the CPR locomotive and then attached to the Hillcrest one so it could be transported. The rescue cart, it was good on paper, but poor in practice. The entire process was excruciatingly slow for everyone involved, and the rescue car didn't get to the mine until 11 a.m., an hour and a half after the disaster. In the end, instead of dealing with switching locomotives, the 12 rescue breathing apparatuses on board were loaded into a wagon and hauled up to the mine, one of which we know helped save one of the miners. Meanwhile, at the mine, all rescue operations were slow. Anyone going in to rescue miners or retrieve the dead knew the dangers of going into the mine full of toxic gas. And before entering, they were required to write their wills. George Vickers and his rescue crew were one of the brave ones. When they reached the interior, they found bodies strewn in every direction and in every conceivable position. Jerry McLeod, known as Doc, entered the mine to find John Hood, his close friend and Frank Slide survivor. They made it a short distance before they felt the impact of the toxic gases, and Doc fell against a wall and vomited. Others on the recovery team hauled him back to the surface to recover, and once he felt better, Doc went back into the mine and managed to make it 95 meters deep, where he found the body of his friend. Hood had been burned across his upper body and face, but somehow it survived the initial blast, but succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning shortly after. By 11:30 a.m., 2 hours after the disaster, there were only 40 survivors. Outside the mine, loved ones anxiously waited for those who had survived. The Calgary Herald reported, "The scenes around the mine tell a terrible tale of the havoc wrought at the fearful force of the explosion. It is only with the greatest difficulty the gangs of rescuers, armed as they were with the latest scientific devices for saving life in such cases, can make any headway. Men, horses, timber, and rails and wagons are jumbled in chaotic mass, and the path is strewn at every step with the debris, so that only those men who were fortunate enough to have been working near the pit mouth have had any chance of being brought out alive." Meanwhile, search and rescue operations continued, and over the course of that day, coal cars surfaced loaded with charred and disfigured bodies. The victims of the disaster were then taken to the wash house where they were cleaned and identified. It was a graphic and gruesome endeavor. Because of the violence caused by the explosion, most of the victims weren't intact and in some cases had to be pieced together just to identify them. To dull the grief and horror, the volunteers were supplied with a constant stream of alcohol as they prepped each body by wrapping it in a shroud. They were then transported to a freight wagon and taken to the Union Hall where they were laid out in rows where loved ones waited to identify them. The Winnipeg Tribune reported on the grim proceedings by stating, quote, "Wives and children wept together, and even strong men broke down and bowed their heads to the inevitable. Widows were led away from the last fond gaze of all that is mortal of their husbands, and the moist eyes of onlookers were not a few. It was not infrequent that the lids of caskets were opened and kisses imprinted on the cold lips of loved ones. Meanwhile, the surrounding communities pitched in to help. Many of them were women who were married to miners themselves. They cooked for rescuers, volunteers, and families. Some even arrived with wash tubs and buckets already full of coffee. With the sudden influx of people, food supplies in Hillcrest quickly dwindled, and that's when residents of Blairmore and Coleman sent 1,200 loaves of bread. By the time night fell, what had happened in Hillcrest was the worst mining disaster in Canadian history. The death toll was staggering. Most bodies had been retrieved by the end of the week, except for 2 that weren't found for a month. One miner was never found. In the end, of the 237 men who went into the mine that morning, only 48 came out. Of the victims, 43 were Austrian, 30 were Ukrainian, including 6 from the same village. Only 17 were born in Canada. All were looking for a better life for themselves and their family. And in a single moment, almost 20% of the town's population was gone forever, and the ripple effect was immense. There were now 90 new widows and 250 fatherless children, and many of them were from the same family. The Petrie family lost 3 sons in the mine. Among them was 17-year-old Alexander Petrie, who had only been working at the mine for 3 weeks and hadn't even received his first paycheck. David Murray was killed along with his 3 sons, David, Robert, and William. His wife was left to raise their 7 other children alone. Charles Elick, the other survivor from the Frank slide, didn't make it out of the mine, and on the same day he died, his wife Julia gave birth to their son. Alfred Johnson died in the mine as well. He had recently married Florence, and on that day she lost a husband, her brother-in-law, and her father in the blast. The Hillcrest mine disaster ripped through families and left them in tatters. For days on end, trains left Hillcrest transporting the many dead to their hometowns elsewhere in Canada and Europe. Many others found a final resting place in a mass grave. Their caskets had their name chalked on the outside, and then they were buried side by side depending on their faith. Over 600 people stood at the cemetery to watch the burial, and one of them was Pat Cosimo. And as he stared at the caskets, a cold shiver ran through his body. There in the dirt was a casket with his name on it. He had been mistakenly identified as a victim due to the sheer number of bodies. The weekend after the disaster, over 117 victims were buried, and some mourners did not leave until the sun went down. As the town grieved, donations from around the world poured in. The Canadian government gave $50,000 to the Hillcrest Mine Relief Fund, while the Alberta government donated $20,000. The head of the Eaton's company, John Craig Eaton, contributed $1,000 to the fund, which by July 6 had raised $82,000. And while Canadians were generous, the mine owners were not. The families of victims had to sue to get any sort of compensation, and in the end, most widows received $1,800, or about $43,000 today, which was paid out at $20 per month over the course of 7.5 years. Austrian miners and their families received no compensation until peace was declared between Austria and Great Britain, which would not come until the end of the First World War, 4 years later. And as the dust settled and people grieved, that grief turned to anger, and as with any disaster, 2 things had to be determined. How did it happen, and who was to blame? To answer the questions, a royal commission was formed, and their consensus was that a small methane gas explosion ignited coal dust in the air, which created a larger explosion and caused most of the air in the mine to be consumed. It then left behind the afterdamp that killed most of the miners. Now this was all speculation because in the end, no official cause was found, as there was a lot of finger pointing about who didn't follow the rules. However, in the wake of the disaster, there were several improvements to the mining industry. Most notably was the requirement that every mine had to always have a rescue team available with self-contained breathing apparatuses on site. There were also improvements in safety regulations and worker compensation benefits for miners. But you might be wondering, what happened to the mine and Hillcrest after the disaster? Despite the dangers of coal mining, after the Hillcrest mine reopened in July 1914, it operated for some time after. By then, new miners had arrived looking for work, but few new safety features were implemented, and by 1926 there was another explosion where 2 miners died. With that, the mine's days were numbered. The company went into liquidation in April 1938, and the mine closed for good on December 2nd, 1949. And without the lifeblood of the community, the town suffered as people moved away. From 1941 to 1966, the population fell from 783 to 551. But it has rebounded slightly since then, with just over 600 people now calling Hillcrest home, thanks to an increase in tourism and traffic on the Crow's Nest Highway. And those that visit can find a memorial, now standing at the Hillcrest Cemetery. It is a lasting reminder of that terrible day over 110 years ago, when 189 men went to work and died in the dark, struggling to breathe, with their last thoughts of their loved ones they were about to leave behind. This show is researched, produced, and written by me, Craig Baird, with the help of Dila Velasquez. Audio production and design by Rosalind Kufor. If this is your first time listening and you like what you heard, please take a moment and give us a 5-star review to help other people find these amazing stories. And there are so many for you to sink your teeth into. If you enjoy this podcast, then please check out my other podcasts, From John to Justin, Canada, A Yearly Journey, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War. We love hearing from you, so if you have a show topic you want me to cover, email me at craig@canadaehx.com. Or stop by my website and social media. I'll include all of those in my show notes. Until next time, I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X.